Well, a few days back, it was April Fool's Day, and every year on April Fool's Day, we release our annual Fool or Forecaster report. And this year we put together a bank scorecard. Do any of them do a good job of forecasting the property market? Which ones are the most reliable? Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, and author of Auction Ready.
And I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker. Before we get started, I need to let you know that nothing we say on here can be taken as personal advice. We always recommend you engage the services of a professional.
Don't forget that you can access the transcript for this episode on the website, as well as download our free Fool or Forecaster report. Which experts can you trust to get it right? theelephantintheroom.com.au. We've been looking at the predictions for the 2021 property market and comparing them to what actually happened. Did anyone get it right? After all, what an unexpectedly hot year it was. Who should we have listened to? Should we have listened to anybody? And I had a bit of fun researching and uncovering 3 compelling reasons why we need to be very careful of relying on what the experts say. 1, their track record. 2, they rarely agree with each other. And 3, we fail to hold them accountable. More about that coming up. And you can download your free 2022 bank scorecard now on the website, theelephantintheroom.com.au. Okay, Chris, let's tackle the track records first. Now, you looked into some data going back to 2014 and compared it to what actually happened. What did you learn?
Yeah, so it was an interesting research assignment, I guess. And, I wanted to use actual released bank reports rather than, media grabbing points out of reports. So it was actually hard to get them, back in 5-6 years ago. But we ended up getting them for NAB all the way back to 2014. And, when we look at the sort of forecast as well, banks are always very similar in terms of what they're predicting. And so I'd like to say that a lot of the banks probably, got these same mistakes wrong. But if we look at sort of, 2014, they suggested house prices would go up 6% across the country. And that was kind of right. They only went up around 6%, but they completely underestimated, how hot the Sydney market boom was going. And they were also maybe a bit optimistic sort of with Perth in 2014. So that was the 2 sort of things they got wrong. All the other states just were pretty close and, similar growth to what they forecast. But in 2015, we remember at that time as well, a lot of people thought the boom would slow down, but it didn't. It actually just went on another run. And they completely underestimated the growth in the Sydney market again, thinking it might only grow by 4%, and it did 11%. Same in Melbourne, they thought it might go up by 2 or 3%. It went up by 8%. And another real story there is they probably thought Brisbane was going to be stronger than it was, and it wasn't. And they thought Perth would still stay strong, and it actually went backwards. So, you can see there they didn't get it right in 2014 on a, maybe at a macro level, the number, but then they completely underestimated the boom. The same again in 2015. 2016 was a bit of a shock for them again, because they said, oh, no, the market's going to slow down. And Sydney went on another rampage and did another 13%. And the same in Melbourne. They actually thought Melbourne would fall in 2016, and it went up 9%. They've sort of switched on to Perth here and thought, well, Perth's struggling a bit here because it dropped 4% last year, and it ended up dropping another 4%. But they thought that, house prices wouldn't, property prices wouldn't go up in 2016, but they actually went up 8%. So I'd say they've got it wrong. They've completely underestimated the power of the market and the demand in that sort of boom. In 2017, I think they started to get it right, because naturally affordability started to kick in 2017. They were pretty bang on in Sydney. They still underestimated how much it would, go up in Melbourne, because Melbourne still kept kicking a little bit later than Sydney. So I think they did pretty well in 2017, but I think they didn't know. And at the start of 2018, they thought, well, the market's going to be just a slow cool down. But what they didn't know is the impact of the credit crunch and the Royal Commission. And so it actually fell a lot more than they were expecting. So they thought maybe it'd be 0% across the country, and it actually fell 5%. So they've completely underestimated the downturn, I guess, and the impact of the Royal Commission. And then when they went back into 2019, they were forecasting, quite significant force to continue. But if you look at the 2019 years, that was the year the market bounced back. And so if you were basing your decisions on the banks here, you would have potentially got out of the boom way too early. Then you would have potentially got in too late, because you would have said, well, I'm not going to buy because all the banks are thinking prices are going to fall this year. Well, actually, early 2019 was the ultimate time to buy. It was actually, pre sort of, there was the liberal sort of thing that was, but this is the problem with forecasts. The information they're basing it on isn't sort of set in stone, and that impact isn't widely known. So, they would have thought maybe the negative gearing things, the credit crunch would have been, much harder, and the Royal Commission, and then bang. They were over 10% out in Sydney. They thought 5% down and went 5% up. And so they've completely missed it. So I would say the track record's pretty poor up to 2019. They keep getting it wrong each way. 2020 was an interesting, obviously that was COVID. And they were all expecting it to be a bit brighter than it was. But, that's the other issue with forecasting. These black swan events like COVID come in. And, the growth wasn't anywhere near what they probably thought, just because of, what happened in 2020. But 2021 was the big one that they all missed. All the banks thought growth might be, around, 5 to 10% in the different cities. But we all know prices went up, 25% in Sydney, 27% in Brisbane, 30% in Hobart. They thought maybe 5% in Hobart. So they got it completely wrong in 2020. And so, up to today, I would say they haven't been close any year besides, maybe 2017. They had a good year, just calling the top of the boom. And that's about it. Every other year, they've sort of got it wrong. And so track record is not looking good if we're going to use that as a reason to believe them.
So it's pretty scary, isn't it? You think, okay, these are economists that we look up to. And in the research that I was doing to put together this year's report, I came across this term called authority bias. How we love our behavioural biases on the elephant in the room. And the authority bias being that us, the punters, will give more credence in many respects to a bank economist because they're, they are respected. They're held up in high esteem. A lot of them have got doctorates. They're all very smart people. And so we just sort of say, well, the bank said it's going to go down. And despite the fact that they have this, and this is just one bank, they've all got similar records. Yeah. It's just that we don't actually have the ready access to all the data in the same way we do with NAB. And so, I looked into, who predicted these other huge events, such as GFC or Brexit or the fallout from either of those, and who accurately got that right, and I was starting to research, how many economists actually predicted the GFC? And I found, look, I think I don't have the exact amount because apparently I found all these other articles around people that claimed that they predicted it, but they didn't really. And it's all this sort of, how do you define who predicted it? But there was one article was put out by CPA Australia that I read that sort of pulled out 6 economists that they say predicted the GFC, and one of them was Australian. Do you want to have a guess? I don't think you've read this part of the report yet, have you, Chris? Do you have a guess at which economist predicted it?
Oh, well, I think I have it's obviously Steve Keen, yeah? That's,
yes.
But he's like a Harry Dent, no offense to Steve. He's one that's always predicting a massive fall in prices, and he's never updating his prediction to current prices because, if it was 40% what you said in 2006 or 2008 or whenever you were making these big bets, you've got, is it still 40% on that price or is it 40% on today's price? Because it'd be a lot bigger than a 40% drop today to get back to what you thought it would have been.
Yeah. The thing with him, which was quite interesting, is that he has been railing against the high amount of debt that, in our household debt and the debt, propping up the property market in this country. So he's been a long hill proponent against the amount of debt that is, fueling us, our economy, I guess. So that's sort of his rationale, that there's so much debt, so therefore it's got to crash. It's sort of oversimplifying it, of course. I mean, he is a doctor, he is a professor. But if someone could actually predict the GFC, yes, it's like, well, I keep predicting something that's really dire and eventually something will happen. And I go, yay, I was right. Or do you look at what else is predicted? And, he's the one who's famously had to walk from Canberra to Mount Kosciuszko because he lost a bet back in 2010, I think it was. And so, he continues to predict, like you say, the similar things. In fact, there was one In 2018, I think, he's predicted 40 to 70% falls in Australian property prices. And I think it was Peter Switzer that asked him, when's that going to happen? And he said, give it 5 years.
Yeah.
So he might well yet be proven right. But I think the point really around this isn't so much about Stephen Keen. It's more about, these are really big events with a lot of signs pointing towards them that, of course, in retrospect and the benefit of hindsight, everyone goes, oh, of course, you could just see it all lining up ready to happen. And yet, even with all of that, there's something like 3,000 economists, according to the RBA in Australia, practicing economists. Apparently, not all of them have a degree, by the way, interestingly enough. So they call themselves, I don't know how they get to do that. But
like accountants, yep.
Yeah, not quite. You have to have a degree to be an accountant. Yeah. You don't have to have a degree to be a buyer's agent, though. But the economists that are calling themselves economists that aren't necessarily degreed economists, there's 3,000 of them in the country, and only one of them apparently predicted the GFC. So what does that say?
Well, I mean, I guess it's just the difficulty in predicting those real black swan events. That was a pretty horrible sort of outcome. To see that coming, I mean, you might be able to see it on paper, the stats showing that, but to actually then just say it's going to happen this year and this is how it's going to happen. It's very hard. And obviously, COVID's another one of those things that, or the war in Russia and the impact of that on inflation, et cetera. And so it's all these things that happen during the year that you look back a year later and go, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, I get it. But every year something new happens and it completely pushes what you thought was going to happen out of the way. And basically your forecast is just sort of ruined. I think the interesting thing with all this forecasting is that it just sells papers. This was selling, massive headlines when all the banks come out with this forecast every year, and every quarter they get more media. And so they're just feeding the beast, and the media just lap it up, because whether it's up or down, it's a great news story.
Well, even at the moment, though, and it begs the question, is the chicken and the egg question, are the headlines enough to sway the market, or are they reflective of the market, right? So I think, maybe it's that overconfidence effect. I think maybe the bank economists maybe think that they are in a position to have an impact on the market, because it does seem to be that some of these predictions come out before we start seeing any evidence of a market turn. And then it's like everyone starts talking about self-fulfilling, So I think that's, I guess we're in one of those stages at the minute, this after the first quarter of 2022, and we are definitely seeing a slowdown, and we've talked about it with Kent, a slowdown in certain markets, and what will that mean? It's a downturn or just a slowdown? Who knows? But and how much impact are those headlines actually having?
I think it was interesting. I think CBA were predicting that 2022 was going to be a bit of a tougher year. When you compare that to what ANZ and Westpac were thinking this year, so Westpac thought Sydney, for example, were going to rise 6%, and ANZ said 9%. ANZ thought Brisbane was going to rise 16% this year, and Westpac said 10%. And so they're very positive on the market. But you can already see in Feb, that was sort of the December sort of predictions. In Feb, Westpac said, no, we were wrong. We thought Sydney was going to grow 6 or 8% in Melbourne, but now it's 0, because new data's come in, inflation's a lot higher than people expected, interest rates look like it to increase faster. We think that fear is going to play into the market. And so in 3 months, they've changed their forecast dramatically. And so that just shows that, their last forecast was basically worthless, because it hasn't even expired. 3 months later, they basically throw that out and bring in something completely different. And who's to say in 3 months' time is not another whole new forecast? So that's the problem with it, is new information comes in and it's basically invalid, even in a quarter. That's how short it is.
And yet you get people talking about it and acting on it. In July 2021, Finder does an RBA cash survey every month. Yep. I think it's every month. And in the middle of last year, out of their panel of 40 experts and economists, 28 made a call on New South Wales house prices, with 68% of them, so just over 2/3 of them, predicting that prices would peak before the year was out, right? That left a third disagreeing. And actually the third that disagreed were right. Even though things have slowed down, you look at the CoreLogic Home Value Index released on the 1st of March 2022, it showed year-to-date dwelling prices had actually increased in Sydney, okay, tiny amount, but still increased by 0.5%, and the rest of New South Wales by 3.3%. So growth is undeniably slowed across the state. However, prices haven't peaked. So once again, if people are saying, oh, well, 2/3 of these experts agree, I'm going to go with the wisdom of the masses, but, if those experts can't agree, I mean, really, who can the punters choose to rely on,
Yeah, I do think a lot of this stuff is, a bit pointless, to be honest, to sort of track, because, we're actually not a lot of people think, oh, we're not going to talk the market up and we don't think the market's going to fall. I actually do, and Chris Joy is probably one of the, the most respected out there. He's called the market on the way up. He called the market down and also back up much earlier than people. And he's calling the market to drop quite significantly, 15 to 25%, I'm pretty sure he said, back in October. And they're massive falls. And I actually do think that, the numbers aren't going to look quite pretty over the next few years if interest rates do jump quite significantly. And it's likely that, they are going to jump a fair whack. How much is a bit unknown, depending on how much it slows down the economy and, how scared homeowners get with their mortgages and stop spending, etc. But, that even if the market does slow down and a lot of pockets do fall in value, that doesn't mean that the property that you want to buy in your street and is going to be cheaper in 2 years' time, or you're going to be able to buy it any easier than you can this year. And I think that's what's always lost in these stories is that, Sydney could fall, but that doesn't mean the type of property you want to buy or own is actually even falling.
Well, we are seeing that on the ground in Sydney, and every agent is saying it to me. Oh, yeah, it's just gone back to the good old days where the good stuff gets competition and the bad stuff is hard to sell.
Yep.
And that is a normal market, right? I think that interestingly enough, I was listening to one of Stuart Weems' podcasts the other day about will interest rates, result in price falls. And he actually has got a chart there, and I'll put the link in the show notes here. He's got a chart there that tracks, I think it's Australian house prices versus interest rates over the past, I think, 30 years.
Yeah.
Reopen the chart. And there's actually no correlation. And then, and I sent him a message about it, and he sent me a screenshot of a tweet from the Kook that was basically, he was basically saying the same thing. He said, when will economists stop saying that the interest rates go up or down, the prices naturally follow?
Yeah.
It's not necessarily it's very loose, the correlation. Even looking at that data, I was like, oh, that's quite and this is the thing too, we go, oh, that seems sensible, that seems believable and understandable, or logical, but it isn't necessarily the case. So I think that we all need to be a bit more, have a bit more interrogation into what we're believing, because as we talk here, this is why we do this report every year, because it's just like, hang on a minute, stop just following this stuff like sheep, start questioning, start looking a bit deeper, start looking at what falls in value. I mean, I wrote a report back at the end. When did I write it? It was beginning of 2019, actually. And I looked at data, properties that had sold, that had been purchased in the lead up to the peak of that market and then sold within 18 months of that peak, and how many of them had sort of lost money versus held their own versus made a small profit. And some actually did make a small profit in that time. So it is not true that every single property loses value. I've done loads of case studies over the years on that. But another one about economists or experts agreeing. So in March 22, very recently, the Scope Economic Survey, which has been published in the Herald, 17 out of the 20 experts gave predictions for 2022 Sydney prices, and they ranged from a 3% fall to a 20% increase. And only one forecast negative growth, and two predicted 20%, and the vast majority, that's 70% of them, sat between 0 and 6%. So with that sort of spread, how could you possibly go, oh, I'm going to go with that one? 16 gave predictions for 2022 Melbourne prices, which were generally less optimistic, ranging from a 5% fall to a 16% increase. Two of them forecast negative growth, two are in double digits, and the remaining 12 sat between 0 and 8. So as with before, the Finder survey, the majority were wrong. The minority were right. In this lot, what do? Do you go, if you're going to go with the minority, you go to the big minority or the small minority? I mean, it's just a bit crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, it's so interesting though, because late last year, there was a lot of heat behind the market. APRA came in with their sort of increasing the serviceability buffer, which reduced borrowing capacities, which was just sort of try to scare the market because it was just so out of control. And the big fear that was what's going to happen at the start of this year is that prices were going to jump like they did at the start of 2021. And that's what was, we were probably all thinking about. But then bang, interest rates around the world really jumped up, fixed rates jumped up, inflation figures, the media jumped on it. And I think it's just a lot more stock came on the market, not great stuff, to be honest. And buyers are a bit nervous, sellers are a bit nervous as well. And the competition isn't there and prices are starting to level off. And the stuff that's not that great, people aren't willing to compromise on because they're scared about interest rates. And so it can just show how fast things sort of flip on sentiment. You've got the sort of Westpac surveys around time to buy, and you can see that that's actually at really all-time lows. It's the last few years it's been at all-time highs. And so, it's just crazy how fast things can move. And it's the dangers with trying to be out there and make forecasts, on macro levels is because, especially in the property market. I think in the share market, it's a bit different. You can buy the index. Within the property market, you've always then got to just go down to your property and your suburb and your street and then look at the quality of your asset. Now, there is a bit of danger there because if you paid a big price last year for a compromised property, then you are in a bit of a danger period, I believe, over the next couple of years. If interest rates jump up quite dramatically, you could potentially, and you have to sell for a life reason, death, divorce, just lifestyle change, financial instability, etc. You might not be able to, recoup that price in 2021 if it's a compromised property and you bought in a boom. And that's one of the risks of people buying last year, and that's even in quality suburbs. So, we're not there to say that, just the suburb saves you. It all comes down to the property within that suburb.
100%. And I've got, as I said, case study after case study that demonstrates that. Now, Chris, you compared bank forecasts for 2020 and 2021 against what actually happened. Was there, and you mentioned earlier, there's a bit of synergy in those forecasts. Was there anything notable? If you like what you're hearing here, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars, please. Every review helps make it easier for other people to find us and hear what our amazing guests have to say. We love hearing your questions and we're planning more listener Q&A episodes. Please send your questions in. You can send them via the website, which is theelephantintheroom.com.au, or directly via email to questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au.
2021 everyone was just so off. It was just a year that no one predicted, right? No one thought Sydney would go up 25%. Westpac said 3%. Look at that's in Sydney. Brisbane, they said 8%, 28% it went up. I think it was interesting, the Brisbane story is that a lot of people were sort of thinking it would boom and it sort of didn't. And I think a lot of people in the 2014 to 2019, I think people underestimated the downturn in Perth. I think that was the big thing. NAB didn't do too much on Hobart. So Hobart was another sort of surprise story, I guess, in that sort of, 2017 to 2020 period where it's growth. So I'd say 2021 was just a year where no one predicted anywhere near the growth that actually happened. And that's just as bad as over predicting downfalls. It's actually worse because if you think there's no urgency in making a property decision because the Westpac said Sydney's only going to go up 3% and it went up 25%. Well, thanks for that, Westpac. I'm glad we listened to your advice.
Yeah, it's a worry, isn't it? And I think I listened to this podcast called the Being Human podcast. This economist called John Kay, an English British economist, and he's written this book called Radical Uncertainty. And so he's basically, I guess he's posing the question, well, can risk really be quantified using probability? And he's really bringing it into managing, like a management style book, I guess, in terms of how do you manage risk that you can't possibly predict, all these unpredictable things. The most certain thing about the world at the moment is that something uncertain is going to happen. You know what I mean? It's like we all know when we look backwards, oh yeah, that year was weird, had this happen and that happened. And it's like every single year there's something more uncertain. We've got floods, we've got war, World War III. I mean, at the minute, so you've got all this stuff going on. Every time we go, oh, that's because of that, that's because of that. But the reality is that this change is constant. really. And so predicting, when you actually are trying to mathematically map it out in using known formulas and known models, assuming that you actually can predict all the I guess the inputs, every input and every variable into those models, it's a bit arrogant, really, don't you reckon?
Yeah, and I just don't think people get really lost in the numbers. I think with property, I think I do think that you should be thinking about property from a risk point of view first, right? And say, well, what is the risk of buying this property? What could change to the city, etc., and try to reduce that risk. What could happen to the neighbour's property? Well, it's a heritage listed house on a good street, and rules around here are you can't subdivide, and that's unlikely to change because the heritage overlay. So that's a risk that is. And there's lots of trees around here, and it's harder to cut down trees, and so that's going to more likely be leafy in the future. And and so I think you've got to always be thinking about property from a risk point of view and try to manage the risk on the downside, right? Because that's the best way to sort of maximize the return, I think, if you can think like that. So I do think risk is so important, but the return is just so unknown. Like, I think COVID was a really interesting thing where you would think that, cities would grow, the people would want to be working in the city prior to COVID, all the high paying jobs would be in the city. You wouldn't expect working from home to be mass adopted anytime soon because of, just it's such a huge shift. And the growth of properties around the city would be the highest. But COVID taught us all a lesson. It sort of showed that, that model's shifted now. You've got growth in there is still great because of people who do need that sort of flexibility in the city, but now it's created opportunities for bigger houses in the suburbs and the sort of regions, etc. And so that caught us off guard, right? I think, we wouldn't have, say, bet on the hubs because we didn't think there would be anywhere near as much growth as they would be around the city, but that taught us, and it taught me definitely a big lesson. I was always positive on those areas, but I didn't think in the short term it'd be a better bet than, say, around the city.
Well, there wouldn't have been. I mean, with COVID, the one thing that's been said across so many disciplines around COVID is that it's accelerated 10 years worth of change into one, effectively. So, there's, once again, it's the thing that you could never have predicted. If you're basing all the inputs on things we already know, of course you're never going to predict that,
Yeah.
So, but I think too that it does, beg the question. So when the market's rising, people think the risk is not being in it, right? And so then they pile in buying all sorts of crap and paying, overpaying for B and C grade properties. When the market turns, though, they look at the risk and think, oh, the risk is paying too much, right? The risk isn't paying too much. It's still buying the wrong property, or in this case, in a falling market, it's not buying the right property. That's actually your risk. So it doesn't come down to paying too much. It's around, basically understanding the market, understanding, like you say, looking at each individual property for its risk, an area for its risk, the property for its risk, and also your own lifestyle and what's important to you and what you need, and getting all of those elements sort of right in the right balance. So on a micro level, on a personal level, that's what a lot of people do when the market turns. They go, right, that's it. I'm going to sit on my hands and wait for prices to fall. But they're then thinking, it's like they think micro in a rising market when they really need to think macro. And I think they do the reverse in a falling market. They need to continue thinking micro.
Yeah, I agree. I think the getting a quality asset's actually potentially going to get harder. Because, if there is any sort of downturn and prices are starting to fall, the medians are falling, even in quality suburbs, medians will fall. It doesn't mean that the best properties are falling. And, sellers will start saying, well, the market's not that great at the moment. I'm just going to sit on my hands. That's what the 2018-19, that period for clients was really tough. We had lots of clients pre-approved. We bang home quality every day to them and try to convince them not to buy a lot of properties. And, tell them things they don't really want to hear, don't validate it if we don't think it's a great asset. And, at that point in time, it was just, look, there's not much out there. And then they'd finally find one, and then they'd go to it and there'd be 40 people at the auction. And that's the same thing that's going to happen. Yeah, it's the same thing's going to happen, I think, in the next couple of years. The stuff that's not is compromised is going to sit on the market. We're already seeing that. The good stuff's going to get all the buyers, and it's going to be harder to buy those because everyone's going to have a crack at that, and it's still going to go for a decent price. I also think that families aren't going to get scared off by rates in the threes. A lot of the people are going in there with big deposits in the upgraded market. And, there's a portion of society that's doing very well financially. inflation is also linked to wage increases, and those wage increases aren't even, and some jobs and professions are getting huge wage increases, and some people within those are getting big bumps because they're going up the tree. So I think there's enough quality demand out there that are at a life stage where they need to make a property move. They can't wait 5 years because of schooling, or they don't want to. They want that lifestyle benefit, and they're not going to get scared off with rates in the threes because they've had 20-30% increases to their salary.
Well, they're probably around last time when rates were up there anyway. So I've been there. I've had it. I survived it. I've actually been there with much higher rates. So it's like a lot of people, I think, are a little bit older. They're actually thinking, well, we've had a lovely time, and a lot of people have paid down a lot of debt, or they've actually built up their buffers and their offset accounts in that time because they've enjoyed the fact that we've had such low rates. So no, that's certainly been one of my focuses, to take advantage of that.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
I think you're right. They're looking at the 3s and 4s, and they still think that's cheap because it's only been a year or two at 2s. And that when we were getting, I remember I was getting a 4-year fixed rate under 4%. We were like, wow, that's amazing. A couple of years ago. It didn't end up being amazing for clients because rates just completely crashed, as we know. But we were like, wow, that's an awesome rate, and I do think...
I know, it's all relative.
Yeah, when rates go back, I don't think it's going to stop demand at, the 3s and 4s. Now, if it gets up to 5s and 6s, that's a different sort of journey. But if it gets to that, you'd like to think that the economy is booming, wage increases are huge, inflation's rampant, and, that's not a bad thing for property prices, to be honest, when, wage increases are pretty massive across the economy and inflation. So... yeah, I think that's the big risk, is the people that have paid a lot of money last year for compromised assets. The people right now buying in areas where higher interest rates are going to hit them harder. So a lot of house and land packages, a lot of areas where there's a lot of debt with, one income or 1.5 incomes because it's a young couple with kids. Their jobs and their industries are maybe more affected, whether it's retail with consumer spending or whether it's tourism or etc. And so, incomes are already tight. There's not much wage growth. Maybe they've only got one salary. And then if expenses are going up, like petrol prices, etc., the budget's getting tight, and then their mortgage goes up and they start to feel a bit of debt stress. And, in those markets, it doesn't take much for supply to increase because there's already a lot of new supply. Plus, there's a lot of people, for example, selling. And I do think the few investors that have got, we have one today who's got, 4 properties, that are all in the affordability part. And surprisingly, because of low interest rates, they've gone up so much. They weren't ever great assets. They know that. But they've gone up quite a lot just because of low interest rates. And I think the danger is the people who go and buy in these areas now. The Logans, which we've spoken about for years on here, that's surprised how much that's gone up. And so the apartment markets in Brisbane, it's starting to sort of recover a little bit because there's not that sort of supply overhang. It's the dangerous people who go and buy these high density now, thinking they're going to boom, and then more stock will come in a few years, etc. So there's lots of parts of the market that are going to get repriced on higher rates. It's just maybe not the quality assets which we talk about.
And that's probably not one of the 3 reasons I said that we shouldn't rely on expert predictions, but probably should add a 4th in, which is really about that it's not about, all markets. There's markets within markets, and you've got much higher risk markets than others. I was talking to a client only yesterday, and there's a massive rental shortage in Perth that I had no idea about. Their vacancy rate's gone from 5% down to 0.6%, and very sharp fall. And so they were looking for their son to rent an apartment. Couldn't find anything. So the natural thing was, it's cheap to buy an apartment, and there's lots around, and they're easy. They don't cancel open houses on apartments for sale, but they do on rentals, right? Oh, we'll just buy one. And I said, okay, before you do that, how happy are you to lose money? Oh, I don't want to lose money. It's property. It'll be fine. And I said, well, let me just quickly look up the most recent full or forecaster report. Did you know that in the September 2021 quarter, 38% of apartments sold in Perth sold at a loss? Yep. That's when there's a boom on. It's a massive boom. And 38, that's more than a third, selling at a loss. So I think I've talked them out of buying. I said, do whatever you can. Find some other solution to the problem. Do not buy an apartment.
Yeah, I think you're right, because I think the investors will get out of poor assets that they know as soon as they start to see price increases, because they don't want to lose money. There's always that loss aversion and loss bias. So, and this is what I think will happen in the Brisbane market. You'll get a lot of investors are just held onto them because we're underwater, for example, for a long time. And as soon as they can get their money back in terms of a dollar
Not
back,
phically. Although some of these apartments have been underwater too, actually.
Yeah, probably the ground floor and the car parks.
Yeah.
And I was talking to a client today. There's families all flooded in. It's been pretty horrible when you hear the true stories on the ground. A lot of supply will come on. Like in terms of listings, when there's an opportunity, the prices are a bit higher and you can get out. And so I do think these investor little pockets that have gone up a lot because of affordability and low rates, some of the dangerous pockets, plus the expensive compromised properties. You just got to be really careful right now that, you don't pay a lot of money for an asset that would not hold up well in a downturn. And there's something about it, whether it's, privacy or small bedrooms or the noise or something about it that the market's not going to like. And you go, it'll be right. I'll just buy it anyway. It suits us. It's a risky move at the moment if your life plan changes.
I was reading just a comment on one of those Facebook groups. It was actually a mortgage broker was talking about a client of theirs that had bought a property that I think they tracked it. I don't have it in front of me, but it was something like over the previous 10 years, it had sold, the price had bumped around about the 260,000 mark, bumped around there. I think 2 of the sales have been at a loss, over that period of time. It kept changing hands. And then these people had bought it and I think they paid $780 or something and they thought it was a bargain because everything else was selling over $800 in the area. And I'm like, that's when you look at a track record. So we're talking about economist track record. You can also look at property's track record. That is a property I wouldn't touch with a barge pole. I don't care how cheap it seems compared to everything else. The last owner before this lot, they're the only people probably that make money on that property ever. But the third reason, right, that back to the fool or forecast or the bank scorecard, the third reason that we can't rely on economist forecasts is that we forget to hold them accountable. I think, and did you mention earlier, or was it off air, that Westpac have just released, I think, a forecast for 2024. Here we are in 2022. They can't get the next quarter right. Why the hell are they actually forecasting out the next year or 2 years, right?
Yeah.
And so, you've got, and then they adjust, and it's like, why isn't anyone putting their hand up and go, excuse me, you said in 2024 this was going to happen. Why did you say that? Why did you publish that? Why did you release that? But we forget we're not actually standing up and saying, stop doing it. Why do you think this is?
Look, I think you're right. We're just feeding the beast. The banks have all got these economists. I don't know what they usually get out of these reports. I feel like they're just out of date straight away. They're sort of interesting, but then they're just, especially when you focus on the report. I mean, a lot of the other graphs in there are interesting to sort of track and to sort of get your data points and your reference points and understand, where wages are and unemployment. And it's good to always track these things. But I just, look, when you get to the forecast page, I think it's always a bit of a laugh to sort of look at, to be honest.
Fiction.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's just, they never really, they're not really, a lot of people think with the bank forecast is that they always want to talk the market up. But what's an interesting thing is that, same as real estate agents, they actually want to talk the market down sometimes because that fear of the market falling creates more transactions. And banks see transactions as debt-creating events. Usually the person buying the property takes on more debt than the person selling the property. And so that's how the market goes up. The person selling takes their cash and then goes and buys another property. Most of the people leave the money in the property market. Not many people take money out of the property market and put it into shares or super, etc. Maybe downsizers do that, but not most people. Most people will take that money and go and buy something else. So what ends up happening every time someone sells, it's usually a debt creating event that creates credit growth. And then, so even if they're thinking the market's going to fall, that encourages more people to sell. More people sell, that's more debt created. That's better for their bank profits. That's the reality of the way the banks think of it. So they don't always have to talk the market up because they can talk people into selling, whether it's through fear or whether it's through, they think the market's going to keep on rising and people are going to buy. So they're incentivized both ways.
I think too, honestly, there seems to be disconnect in terms of the understanding of behavior, human behavior. And that's what I guess frustrates me. It's like, what makes you an expert in the property market? Like, really,
Yeah.
what do you really know about how humans behave in the property market?
Yeah.
And because that's fundamentally all it is. I mean, I think the one thing the banks come out with is the consumer confidence indexes. And I think of all the things that they come out with, to be quite frank, that's it.
Yeah.
But then you go back to the headlines, and do the headlines create confidence or what? You know what I mean? And so it's once they're feeding the beast themselves, you know. So I think that for me, that's 3 bloody good reasons why we should not rely on these forecasts. And here we go again, when the headlines and the media and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, what will be will be.
Yeah.
It will unfold.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's just, don't be basing your decisions on what is potentially going to happen with some type of forecast. I think you've just got to focus on terms of the quality of the asset. I know we always say that, but it's true, and understanding, definitely protecting yourself from increasing interest rates. We've always been saying, clients, look, can you afford 3.5%, 4%? You don't want to go and take a big mortgage with no buffer and buy an asset and put yourself into that debt stress if you're really stretching. But most clients aren't, to be honest. Most clients are already, even at 3.5%, 4%, thinking it's fine. And so, yeah, and it's just sort of not trying to time the market too much. It's actually always being super selective right now, because it's more likely that that interest rates are going to scare the market, and so you're buying a poor asset's going to be easier potentially, and just being patient and persistent. We've seen more success this year with clients. It's not our new clients that have been buying; it's the clients who have been looking for longer than 12 months. They're the ones who have bought in this last quarter. They've been very frustrated and missing out a lot last year, but then this year they've been able to make it happen, because what they're doing is they've understood the market, they understand what they want, and they're surprising sellers with sort of offers that, are fair offers on decent assets, and getting sellers who are a little bit nervous and just catching them off guard. And that's what we're seeing a lot of success in, is the buyers who have sort of got that research there, and they're just sort of catching sellers off guard.
I think too that, the buyers that come into the market or re-enter the property market after Christmas, when they've been in it the previous year and it's been a tough year, they have a different resolve to new buyers, and as long as they're not sort of panicking and just buying whatever, they usually come in focused and ready to take advantage of what they find. And I think that there has been more stock on the market this year, so they've been rewarded for that patience and for all that work that they've done. So we've got a couple of clients in that category ourselves, and I'm looking forward to some really good results. We've got a few properties in our sites at the moment. We're looking forward to some good results for them, and we're always counselling people. Don't look. I know it's tough in a rising market to be patient, but don't, because you honestly, it's those people that desperately jump in and then they turn around afterwards. And a lot of those are the people that overpay for crap assets in the peak of the market, and then they turn around and sell because they bought the wrong thing. So there's lots of reasons not to succumb to FOMO. But
you're in a lot of debt for an asset that you're not that confident on. You've got a lot of not regret, but you'd probably be a little bit resentful that you probably didn't be a bit more patient, because you've already seen property selling this year than you could have potentially bought in budget or close to it. And maybe there's more stock on the market. So you sort of just, bought somewhere at the top, and you bought an asset that's not that great. And then finally you're in an asset that maybe has some type of lifestyle compromise that maybe you didn't mean to make, whether it's the road or the noise or the light or your neighbor or whatever it is. And you just sort of have to live there, and you have to deal with that stressful thing in your lifestyle, knowing you've overpaid for a property and it's not where you want to be long term. And, and those have real impacts on your sort of family situation and relationships. And then potentially you have to sell because things break down, and then you have to crystallize a loss, stamp duty, selling costs, etc. And this is how it all sort of plays out, just all through, being FOMO and then buying a poor asset.
And you got to remember, back to headlines. We're talking about not being swayed by headlines. The headlines were, buy, hurry, 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 hurry. So now if you sort of go, oh, great, I can sit on my hands, that's like a need. The pendulum has to stay in the middle. A smart property buyer, pendulum is in the middle, not being swayed in the direction.
Yeah.
All right, so you can download the bank scorecard and our full forecaster report for 2022 on the website now. That's what is it? theelephantintheroom.com.au. Thanks for tuning in.
Awesome. Another year of fail, more fools than correct forecasters, I guess. And interesting to see how this year goes. I mean, everyone's sort of suggesting prices to sort of stay, around that sort of 5 to 10%. But it's likely that that's all going to be wrong. So we're going to be having the same conversation next year.
We'll try a variation of the theme. If you're looking to buy your dream home or an investment property in Sydney's inner west, eastern suburbs or North Shore, my team and I can help you buy without regrets. Reach out via my website, gooddeeds.com.au.
If you're looking to buy your first home, thinking of upgrading into a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, my team love to carefully guide you on this journey. And most importantly, get the finance right. Reach out via our website, wealthful.com.au.
Thanks for joining us. We'd love to see you again.
And remember, don't be a Dumbo.